Okay, let's unpack this. When you picture early humans and fire, what comes to mind?
Mm.
For most of us, it's that classic scene, gathered around a crackling fire, maybe cooking up a piece of meat after a hunt.
Right, the sort of standard image.
It feels foundational, doesn't it? But what if that cozy meal wasn't the first, or maybe even the most important reason our ancestors bothered with fire?
Well, yeah, that widely accepted picture, while definitely true for, a later phase of human history, it might be skipping over a million years where fire played a different, perhaps even more vital role.
A million years, wow.
Yeah, we're diving into some fascinating new research here. It's from Dr. Miki Ben-Dor and Professor Ran Barkai at Tel Aviv University, just published in Frontiers in Nutrition.
Okay.
And they're proposing a hypothesis that could really shift how we understand humanity's initial relationship with controlled fire.
So our mission in this deep dive is to explore exactly what they're arguing. They suggest that in the incredibly long period before cooking became, routine,
Right.
fire was crucial for two really practical, almost life-or-death reasons. Protecting incredibly valuable meat from massive hunted animals.
Keeping scavengers away.
Exactly. And then preserving that huge quantity of food so it didn't just spoil.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about a hot meal right away. It was about safeguarding what was basically their entire food supply for weeks, maybe months.
A colossal calorie bank.
That's a great way to put it. A calorie bank that represented a massive amount of sustenance.
So let's set the scene a bit. We know that by around 400,000 years ago, the picture changes dramatically.
Oh yeah, completely different.
Fire use was common then in domestic settings. Archaeological sites show hearths everywhere, lots of burnt bones.
Clear evidence.
Yeah, clear evidence that cooking, heating, lighting, they were all regular parts of life by then.
Right, that's the point where habitual fire use is, well, archaeologically obvious, undeniable.
Okay.
But the burning question this research tackles is, what was happening in the massive stretch of time before
A
that?
gap.
That huge gap. We're talking roughly 1.8 million years ago, up to about 800,000 years ago.
Right.
Now, there is evidence of fire at some early sites from this period, things like ash layers, maybe heat-affected stone.
Okay, so hints of it.
Hints, exactly. But crucially, often without those widespread signs of cooking, you don't find piles of uniformly burnt animal bones like we see later on.
So that is the puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Early humans then, folks like Homo erectus, they weren't using fire all the time, and lighting and keeping a fire going wouldn't have been easy.
Not at all. A significant effort.
It required knowledge, fuel, constant attention, maybe a big energetic investment.
Absolutely.
So if they were only engaging with fire occasionally, during this million-year span, there must have been a profoundly compelling reason.
A high reward motive.
Yeah, something that made that effort worthwhile. What could it possibly have been if not regular cooking?
And this is precisely where Dr. Ben-Dor and Professor Barkai offer their new perspective. They argue the primary motive for these occasional fire uses wasn't cooking at all.
It's not cooking?
Okay, at least not in the way we typically think of it, not as the main driver.
So what was the primary motive, according to their hypothesis? What were those critical uses then?
They propose fire served a dual, incredibly practical purpose for groups who were hunting very, very large animals.
Game hunters.
Exactly. First, it was about protection. Imagine taking down an animal the size of an elephant,
Wow.
or a hippo, or a rhino, which we know these early humans were doing based on the bone evidence at various sites.
Okay.
That's a staggering amount of food,
Yeah.
right? But it immediately attracts every other large predator and scavenger for miles around. Lions, hyenas.
Right, you'd have competition instantly.
Big time.
Yeah.
So a fire, even just a smoky one kept going near the carcass, would have been a powerful deterrent, guarding that precious resource.
That makes incredible sense. I mean, you've just invested huge energy and risk into getting this massive prize.
Exactly.
Leaving it vulnerable would be, well, incredibly wasteful. You mentioned the scale of these animals.
And the scale is absolutely key to their hypothesis. As the researchers point out, a single large elephant could provide millions of calories.
Millions.
Millions. Enough meat and fat to feed a band of maybe 20 or 30 people for potentially a month or even more.
A whole month from one animal.
It's hard to even picture. This wasn't just dinner, it was their survival insurance. A fundamental calorie bank, like you said, that had to be secured.
Right.
So using fire occasionally just to protect that treasure against predators, that would have been a minimal energy cost compared to the value being protected. Makes sense.
Totally. Okay, so protection is purpose one. guarding the bank. What's the second critical use they identified?
Preservation. So you've got this enormous quantity of meat and fat.
Yeah.
In a warm climate, especially without refrigeration, it spoils incredibly quickly. Bacteria gets to work almost immediately.
Right. It wouldn't last long naturally.
Not at all. So their hypothesis is that fire was also used to preserve this bounty for the long term, primarily through smoking and drying.
Like making jerky, basically.
Kind of, yeah. Think of how many traditional cultures still smoke meat or fish to preserve it. It's a very effective technique.
Sure is.
This would have dramatically extended the usability of that food supply, turning what would have been a huge temporary surplus
into sustained security. Food for weeks.
Exactly. Food security over a much longer period.
It totally changes the perspective. It's not about making the meat tastier or easier to digest right now through cooking,
Not primarily, no.
but about ensuring you have that meat available for a long, long time. How did the researchers piece this together? What evidence did they look at?
Well, it's interesting. They didn't conduct new excavations for this specific study.
Okay.
Instead, they did a really deep dive into the existing archaeological literature. They looked at prehistoric sites from this specific time frame, that 1.8 to 0.8 million year window.
The gap period.
The gap period, yes, where there was already some published evidence of occasional fire use. They identified 9 such sites globally.
And these include places like Gesher Benot Yaakov and Evron Quarry in Israel, you mentioned.
That's right, and sites in Africa, one in Spain too, so a range of locations.
Okay.
And critically, when they looked at the faunal remains, the animal bones found at these 9 sites,
Yeah.
they noted a very strong common theme: the consistent presence of bones from those very large animals.
Yeah.
Elephants, hippos, rhinos.
So the fire evidence and the megafauna evidence were often found together at these early sites.
Precisely. This fits with their broader work, which argues that early humans, for a long time, heavily relied on hunting megafauna. They saw the fire evidence alongside the evidence of these huge kills. That connection was key.
That link between occasional fire and large animal remains seems really central to their argument.
It absolutely is. And they didn't rely solely on archaeology. They also drew insights from ethnographic studies.
Looking at modern groups.
Exactly. Looking at how modern or recent hunter-gatherer societies handle and preserve large game harvests today.
Right, drawing parallels.
Yeah, comparing those strategies helped them understand the practical benefits and also the energetic costs involved in something like smoking meat versus just letting it rot.
Yeah, makes sense.
And their analysis, which included calculating the potential energetic returns, it basically demonstrated that the advantage gained from preserving such vast amounts of meat and fat through smoking or drying would have far outweighed the effort of generating and maintaining fire just occasionally for that purpose. The payoff was huge.
Okay, that explains the protection and preservation piece really well. But where does cooking fit into this timeline then? If fire was being used occasionally for these other big reasons, did cooking just not happen at all back then?
Well, they don't suggest it didn't happen at all. They propose that cooking likely started to occur, again, occasionally, once fire was already being produced and managed for protection and preservation.
So it's like a secondary benefit.
Kind of, yeah. Think about it. If you've already gone to the trouble of making fire to keep scavengers away from a carcass overnight,
Right.
or you have a smoky fire going constantly to dry strips of meat hanging above it, well, throwing a piece of fresh meat on the embers to cook it, that comes at virtually zero marginal energetic cost, as they put it.
Because the fire's already there. You've already paid the startup cost, basically.
Exactly. You've already invested the significant effort in starting and maintaining the fire for these other critical reasons. A little bit of cooking is just an easy add-on.
Okay. So it's an opportunistic benefit. Like, well, since the fire's here,
Precisely.
this could help explain some of that very limited, very early evidence we have for cooking, right? Like the finds at Gesher Benot Yaakov you mentioned, the fish roasting evidence from around 800,000 years ago.
Exactly. It fits that picture.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily the primary reason for the fire being there in the first place, but it was a handy secondary use that presumably caught on and eventually became much more central much later.
When fire use became more habitual.
Right. And this specific fire hypothesis, focusing on protection and preservation of megafauna kills, it fits neatly into their broader theoretical framework,
Which is about.
which argues that many significant prehistoric human behaviors and adaptations tool use, social structures, maybe even dispersal patterns, are fundamentally linked to how early humans hunted and consumed very large animals,
Okay.
and then crucially, how they had to adapt as those large animals eventually declined in size or disappeared over time.
So this is one piece of a larger puzzle they're building about human evolution and megafauna.
Very much so. And things like, the burnt fallow deer bones found at Kazim Cave, which date later but still show that direct link.
Yeah.
Those finds just reinforce the archaeological connection between fire use and processing animal remains at these early human sites. It's a consistent pattern.
This research really does shift our perspective, doesn't it, on one of humanity's most defining technologies, fire.
It really does.
It highlights how practical, almost logistical problems on a massive scale. Like, how on earth do you protect and store millions of calories from a hunted elephant?
Yeah, it's a heck of a problem.
That might have been the initial powerful driver needed to push our ancestors to overcome these really complex challenges, like controlling fire consistently enough, even just occasionally.
It really shows that the survival advantage conferred by early fire use wasn't maybe just about making food easier to eat or getting warm initially. It was perhaps more fundamentally about resource security, about management, about long-term planning.
Planning ahead.
Yeah, planning ahead for weeks, long before the simple convenience or the more widespread nutritional benefits of cooked food took center stage much, much later.
So wrapping up this deep dive then, the core finding, the main takeaway, is that early human use of fire for maybe 1 million years
A vast period.
was likely motivated not primarily by the desire for a cooked meal, but by the absolutely critical need to protect and preserve the huge life-sustaining resources, the meat and fat from the large animals they successfully hunted.
That's the essence of it. The aha moment here is realizing that the very first campfires weren't necessarily about, gathering for dinner time.
Right.
They might have been much more about guarding that massive food bank and making absolutely sure its contents lasted for the group. Security first.
And this leaves you, the listener, with a thought to consider. If the primary driver for something as fundamental as fire was rooted in complex resource management and security on such a monumental scale, dealing with these huge animal resources, what other foundational human skills or technologies, or maybe even early forms of cooperation and social structure, might have origins tied not just to immediate efficiency or convenience,
Not just making things easier right now.
but to that critical, urgent need to safeguard and extend access to vital resources over the long haul? What else was driven by the need to manage abundance and scarcity?